I wonder if these sermons from this book of Job are getting predictable for you. It's a theme and a message that comes through in every message because it's saturating the book. It's this story of a man who's suffering greatly, and so we are learning how to suffer well and how to help those who suffer, how to help them to suffer well. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. It's a heavy book. It's easy to be discouraged and weighed down when you read through this book. You've got to keep the end in mind. You've got to keep the whole of God's revelation, Genesis through the book of Revelation, in mind. You've got to keep the goodness and the faithfulness of God in mind. And so that's what we're looking to do as we read through this book together. Just a few more weeks, God willing, and we'll have completed this book of Job. It's been good for me. I trust it's been good for you. John Calvin, he famously said about the book of Psalms that the book of Psalms is like an anatomy of the soul. In other words, if you read through the book of Psalms, it takes you inside the souls of its authors. And you see just about everything that a human being could feel and experience emotionally with whatever life brings your way, whether it's sadness or fear or anger or hopelessness or hopefulness. You see all of that come out when you read through the Psalms as they are crying out in prayer and as they are crying out in Psalms. Well, in the same way, the book of Job contains an anatomy of Job's soul. If you read this book carefully and you read the words of Job carefully, you get to see an anatomy of his soul. We see anything and everything that is going on in the heart of this man as he poetically and quite graphically he expresses his emotions, his grief, his confusion, his anger, all of this after God has taken so much from him, including his 7 boys and 3 girls. And at first, looking back, you'll remember that Job reacted with great, impressive strength when he said in chapter 1, verse 21, "The Lord gave, and the Lord is taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." But over time, and with the increasing pain and the onset of a debilitating disease, we've watched how Job's, not his faith, but his strength, it's weakened. I mean, he grows weaker and weaker as the story goes on, weaker in body and weaker in soul. And then on top of that, we remember that it felt like to Job, it felt like God had taken something else away from him. It felt to Job like God had taken himself away. And that was the pain that was unbearable for Job. To lose the support of my wife, to lose my kids, and to lose my livelihood, and to lose friends in a sense, and certainly to lose his own health was one thing, but remember, it was next level for Job to then cry out to God and hear silence on the other end of that, and to feel like his relationship to and with God was somehow broken. C.S. Lewis, after he lost his wife, he said this is how it felt to him, and I think this is similar to what Job was experiencing. Go to God when your need is desperate, when all other help is vain. And what do you find? A door slammed in your face and a sound of bolting and double bolting on the inside. After that, silence. That's not everyone's experience. It was his experience, and it seems to be Job's experience as well. It felt like he was knocking on a door that would not be answered. Everything he loves and lives for has been taken from him, and so we're not surprised when we then fast forward, find Job at the end of chapter 37. He's beneath those storm clouds, and he is a worn down man. He's looking forward to death. He's finding it increasingly difficult to do what he had done, to fear God and to turn away from evil. He's still doing it, but he's finding it increasingly difficult. And up until this point, nothing supernatural has happened, and then a voice thunders down from the heavens. Definitely supernatural. A voice breaks through those storm clouds above him, and it is God, of course, and his words are not what we would expect. And we thought about that together last week. They were words from a whirlwind. And so we looked at half those words last Sunday, and now today we'll read the second half of God's words again. I think they are unexpected, but they are exactly what Job needed to hear, and they're exactly what we need to hear. But first, let's pray together. Our Father in heaven, we ask that you would take your word now and help us to understand it deeply, so that our faith would grow today, our love for you and others would grow, so that you would be glorified. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. If you haven't yet, please turn to Job chapter 40. Job chapter 40. And here's what we noted last week. It was what God speaks and then the way he speaks it, and they are both surprising. What God said was surprising, the content, but also the way he said it. First, the way that God spoke to poor Job was surprising. God does not come to him quietly and gently, which is maybe how we would, and I would even recommend we go to someone who is in as bad a shape as Job. But God doesn't come to him gently like that, not like a shepherd, not drawing alongside him and saying something like, well done, good and faithful servant. We might expect God to draw alongside Job, say something like that. No, God stormed in, and when we say that, we mean literally. He literally came in through a storm, and his words to Job began with, brace yourself like a man. That was surprising. And then what God spoke to Job was also surprising. There was no apology from God for taking so long to respond to his prayers. There was no acknowledgement of Job's suffering. There was no explanation of Job's suffering, only questions. God just rattled off questions, over 50 of them. Over 50 questions to this tired, poor man, asking him questions about the origin of life, about the weather, about the stars in the heavens, about animals. Questions that were rhetorical and were driving home a point. And the point those questions were driving home was, Job, you are small. That was the point. Do you, Job, have the knowledge and the ability to create and govern all things? That's sort of the overarching question that he's hammering Job with. Do you? Do you have the ability? Can you create all things? Can you govern all things? The point God was making to Job is, Job, you are very, very small. I think that was a surprising thing to hear from God. Maybe not what Job expected. But those are the kinds of questions God asks in chapters 38 and 39. And then God pauses, I suppose, to give Job a chance to catch his breath. God is quiet, and Job responds. And here is Job's response in chapter 40, verses 4 and 5. Behold, I am of small account. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand on my mouth. Can you picture that? He's just covering his mouth. I have spoken once, and I will not answer. Twice, but I will proceed no further. God's questions have done something to Job. Job has been made to feel small. He says in verse 4, behold, I am of small account. God's questions have also silenced Job. Verse 4 and 5, I lay my hand on my mouth. I will not answer. Can we say it this way? Job has been put in his place. Isn't that what's happened here? Job has been put in his place. He doesn't know what to say. And so God continues, still speaking out of the storm, verse 8. Will you even put me in the wrong? Will you condemn me that you may be in the right? So God only has this one bone to pick with Job. And at the end, we will see that he's actually pleased with Job, right? What he said about Job in the beginning of this book has remained true. God will see he is pleased with Job. He is pleased with how Job overall has handled his suffering. But there is this one bone to pick. There is this one issue that God takes with Job. It's verse 8. Earlier in verse 2, he had called Job a fault finder. In verse 8, God is explaining what he means. You've put me in the wrong, Job. You have condemned me that you may be in the right. In other words, here's what God is saying to Job. Job, in an effort to maintain your own innocence, you've crossed the line and you've accused me of wrongdoing. And that is not right. And then God continues, verse 9. Have you an arm like God, and can you thunder with a voice like his? So Job had given in to the temptation. He's looking around at his circumstances. He can't explain them. He can't understand what's going on. The pressure, the weight is heavy. It's intense. And so he begins to question God. And he opens this door that maybe, God, you're doing something wrong here. Because one thing I know that I haven't done anything deserving this. I know that I don't have any hidden sin or secret sin like my brothers accused me of. I know that that is not the case. And so instead of just not talking anymore, which Job should have done, he opens this door that maybe God is doing something wrong. And this is the problem that God has with Job. And so God confronts Job here. and puts Job in his place. And we'll see the point that God is making here. Have you an arm like God? Can you thunder with a voice like his? The point God is making, Job, you are not like me. You don't have the knowledge or the judgment or the power to create and to govern the world. So how can you complain about how I govern the world? It's not your place, Job. It's not any human being's place to ever be critical of God. And that's what Job has done, apparently. He has crossed a line, and he has accused God of not doing right, not doing a good job. God says to Job, verse 10, adorn yourself with majesty and dignity, clothe yourself with glory and splendor. Pour out the overflowings of your anger, and look on everyone who is proud and abase him. Look on everyone who is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked where they stand. Hide them all in the dust together. Bind their faces in the world below. Then will I also acknowledge to you that your own right hand can save you. You hear what God is saying. Do that, Job, verses 10 through 13. Rule and govern with that kind of strength and knowledge and power. Do that sort of thing, Job, and then I'll acknowledge to you that you can save yourself and that maybe you have a better way. Well, Job can't do any of those things. Job knows he can't do any of those things. God's point to Job is that he is well out of his league. Isaiah 55:9 comes to mind, which says, for as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. This is the verse that I find myself going to, and of course this entire story of the book of Job, but this is where I go to when I'm confused about what God's doing in my life or in the world or in the life of those that I love, which happens fairly regularly. I don't understand this. This doesn't make sense to me. I may be real silly and think I wouldn't do it that way. Silly thing to think, but I've thought it. And when I'm confused or I lack understanding, something doesn't make sense to me, I remember, of course it doesn't. That's right. God, your ways are higher than my ways. And your thoughts are higher than my thoughts. You are over all things, and you know all things, and you do all things well. Of course, from time to time, I'm not going to understand. That's right. And of course, the book of Job gives us the same message. It's really the height of presumption, isn't it, to question and critique the ways of God? It's the height of presumption. It'd be like me offering to help Steph Curry with his jump shot. Or maybe to help Mike Trout with batting practice, give cooking lessons to Martha Stewart, tell Steven Spielberg how to direct a movie, Dave Ramsey how to handle money, Jeff Gordon how to drive a car. I wouldn't do any of those things. How silly would that be? How ridiculous would that be? Where would I come up with the nerve to do anything like that? And yet, we as Job might be tempted to be critical of the ways of God. So God drives home this point. So God continues. Let's finish reading the words that God has for Job. Next stop, dinosaurs. This is where God goes next. I think they're dinosaurs at least. We could, I guess if you wanted to talk about that and not have too serious an argument about it, but this is where God goes next. Behemoth and Leviathan. These are the names that God gives them. Those names mean great beasts. Behemoth is a land creature, we'll see, and Leviathan is a sea creature. And historically, there's been several interpretations about what these creatures actually are. They could have been dinosaurs, some say. I think that might be right. Demonic creatures, others have said. The hippopotamus and the crocodile. They seem greater than that to me, but there are Christians historically who've thought that's what they describe. It depends on factors like how literally you read the words we're about to read. It depends on when Job lived exactly and whether or not God is talking about animals that were still around at the time. So let's hear what God has to say about each of them. And then our bigger task, let's try and discern why God brings them up. Because again, this may be a little surprising. Now God brings up this great land creature and this great sea creature, and he doesn't just mention them, as we'll see. He has a lot to say about them. So let's start with Behemoth. In chapter 40, verse 15, behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you, God says. He eats grass like an ox. Behold his strength in his loins and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze, his limbs like bars of iron. He is the first of the works of God. Let him who made him bring near his sword, for the mountains yield food for him where all the wild beasts play. Under the lotus plants he lies, in the shelter of the reeds and in the marsh. For his shade the lotus trees cover him, the willows of the brook surround him. Behold, if the river is turbulent, he is not frightened. He is confident though Jordan rushes against his mouth. Can one take him by his eyes or pierce his nose with a snare? A brontosaurus, maybe. Hippopotamus, maybe. But here's the point. He's big. He's strong. He's fearless. He's a frightening animal. I imagine the most frightening animal on land, which is why God brings him up. And God made him. That's the point. God made him. He came from God's imagination. And God rules over him. And he answers to God. It's Behemoth. Let's move on to chapter 41. What about Leviathan? Verse 1, can you draw out Leviathan with a fish hook or press down his tongue with a cord? Can you put a rope in his nose or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many pleas to you? Will he speak to you soft words? Here God is asking Job a lot of questions again, this time about Leviathan, and his questions amount to whether or not Job can control Leviathan. Again, like chapter 39, God is challenging the knowledge, wisdom, and power of Job. God goes on in verse 4. Will he make a covenant with you to take him for your servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you put him on a leash for your girls? Verse 9, behold, the hope of a man is false. He is laid low even at the sight of him. No one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he who can stand before me. God is saying, men fear this sea creature, but they don't fear me. And that's absurd, because God can play with Leviathan like a bird. Leviathan speaks softly to God. God puts him on a leash, and he would curl up at a little girl's feet if God would have him do so, is the point God makes. Leviathan serves God and pleads to God, yet men fear him over God. Verse 18. And here he sounds like a fire-breathing dragon. Verse 18, his sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the dawn. Out of his mouth go flaming torches. Sparks of fire leap forth. Out of his nostrils comes forth smoke, as from a boiling pot and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame comes forth from his mouth. It's pretty cool. Verse 25, when he raises himself up, the mighty are afraid. At the crashing, they are beside themselves. Though the sword reaches him, it does not avail, nor the spear, the dart, or the javelin. He counts iron as straw, and bronze as rotten wood. The arrow cannot make him flee. For him, sling stones are turned to stubble. Clubs are counted as stubble. He laughs at the rattle of javelins. His underparts are like sharp potsherds. He spreads himself like a threshing sledge on the mire. Verse 31. He makes the deep boil like a pot. He makes the sea like a pot of ointment. Behind him he leaves a shining wake. One would think the deep to be white-haired. On earth there is not his like, a creature without fear. He sees everything that is high. He is king over all the sons of pride. This is a magnificent creature. There is nothing like this in all the world, and people are terrified of this creature. And again, here's the point. This powerful, fearless, frightening animal is owned by God. That's the point. So that's what Behemoth and Leviathan are. Now here's our bigger challenge. Why does God talk about them so much? Job has been suffering. He's been asking God why, and he has charged God with injustice. And God's response is a lesson in zoology. But think about it. God's response is to zero in on these two great animals. Leviathan gets 34 verses. There's only so many verses in what God has to say. 34 of them are about Leviathan. It's the entire chapter of 41. What God says about Leviathan, think about it this way, is 28%, I figured it out, it's 28% of the total words God says to Job. So in God's response to Job, he says more about Leviathan than anything else. Does that surprise you? If you and I, let's just think about it this way. If you and I were sitting in a counseling session together and you were helping me counsel someone, and they poured their heart out with all of their questions and all of their struggles, and then I was about to respond to them, and you interjected and said, "Have you considered Bigfoot?" I think I'd look at you perplexed. I'd probably ask you to be quiet, maybe leave the room. What are you doing? What in the world does that have to do with what we're talking about here? Now, you're smart Christians who've been studying the Bible for a long time, and so maybe you're not surprised that God does this, but try to look at it objectively and realize that this is not what you would expect in a response to Job. But this is what God does. And then listen, he's done. He's done. You start flipping through the pages, but there's got to be more. No, this is it. This is how God responds to Job, what we looked at last week, and now what we are reading today. Questions about the origin of life, questions about the weather, questions about stars, questions about animals, and then God rebukes Job, and then he tells him about a couple dinosaurs, and then he's done. Listen, God's ways are higher than our ways, so be surprised by it, but we're not going to be critical of it. God knows exactly what he is doing, but let's think about it together. What are we to make of this? So let's head out of this passage, head out of this sermon, and I'd ask you to take these 3 sort of steps with me to think about this. The first step is, let's ask, what has God done? Let's think about it. What has God actually done here? And I would say, God has given Job a vision of God. God has given Job an understanding, a picture, a vision of God. God has revealed himself. That's what God is doing. God has revealed himself. God has made much of God, is what God has done. God has revealed to Job his knowledge and his power. God has reminded Job of his sovereignty. Everything is under God. Everything is under God. He ends his words, God does, with a description of 2 of the most powerful and terrible things in the entire world, and then he reminds Job that even they belong to God and they are under his control. In chapter 42, verse 11, it says, "Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine." Wow. God says, whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. Famous quote by Abraham Kuyper, "There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, 'Mine. Mine.'" It all belongs to God. Romans 11:36 says, "For from him and through him and to him are all things." God has the whole world, from Leviathan to the tiny little babies, in his hands. The whole world is in his hands. So this is what God has done. God has revealed himself to Job. Step 2, take this step with me. That's what God has done. Did it help Job? Was Job helped? So in one sense, we could measure what God did, whether it was good or bad or could have been better or right or wrong, with, well, he's God, so it's good. That's one answer to that. Is it good what God did? Did he say what was right? Yes. Why? Because he's God, and he does all things well. But let's go ahead and look at the results too and say, did they actually help Job? And maybe we wouldn't see that play out, and we would know that at some point Job was helped. We'd have to believe that, trust that. God works for the good of those who love him. But actually, we find out that Job was helped. We are told that. Remember, God gives Job no answers to his questions. God doesn't acknowledge Job's suffering. He doesn't explain Job's suffering. He just does what we just read that he does. He reveals himself to Job in a powerful way. Was Job helped by that? Look at chapter 42. And let's read verses 1 through 6. Then Job answered the Lord and said, I know that you can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Who is this that hides counsel without knowledge? Therefore I have uttered what I did not understand, things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. Hear, and I will speak. I will question you, and you make it known to me. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Therefore, I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Was Job helped? Yes. This is exactly what Job needed to hear. Those are powerful words that Job says, aren't they? He looks back on the words he said, and then in verse 3 he says, I have uttered what I did not understand. Things too wonderful for me, which I did not know. And you see, by God's grace, in the revealing of himself that God has just done in these 2 chapters, by God's grace, now Job, who felt so distant from God, you remember? And you remember that was the most excruciating part of his suffering? The distance he felt from God. And now Job says, I know you now like I never knew you before. I had heard of you. Here's how he looks back at his relationship with God before this. I had heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. What's Job not thinking about right now? His suffering. What's Job thinking about right now? God, my eye sees you. And then he says, I despise myself. Feels guilt, conviction. Can't believe I said some of the things I said. Can't believe I started to waver. Can't believe it was ever in my heart to question you. He's saying, I'm so sorry, God. Forgive me, God. He repents. So yes, Job was helped. God revealed himself. Job was helped. Now, step 3, and in conclusion, and it's probably obvious to us by now, but what is it about what God said that helped Job? God is helping Job here. It's what Job needs to hear for his good. What God has done is made much of himself. He's changed Job's perspective, taken his eyes off of his suffering and put them back on God where they belong. And this would be the same for us, that God is loving us when he makes much of himself. God is loving us when he makes much of himself. God is loving Job when he makes much of himself. We might think that the most loving thing God could have done for Job, and this would be wrong to think this, but it might be what we would do with somebody who's suffering, We might think that God would come to Job and put his arm around him and tell him how proud of him he is and it's going to be okay. And, you feared me. You've turned away from evil. You've handled this really well. Well done, good and faithful servant. I just want to remind you, how much this is not what God does. That might be what we would do with someone who is suffering and someone that we love. We would make much of them. Isn't that how you love somebody, we might think? By making much of them, making a big deal of them. Isn't this what our culture says love is? To make them think much of themselves, to make them feel better about themselves. And so we say things that we think will make much of them. That's not love. Love is doing what is best for a person. Love is doing what's going to be best for their peace and their hope and their joy and their future. And the best for everyone is God. And so the best thing we do for those we love is to make much of God. Not to make much of them, but to make much of God. The most loving thing that God can do is to direct us, to direct our attention and love and worship and obedience to himself. Not to anything else. Not to ourselves, not to live for ourselves, not to live for others. Others will let you down. You will certainly let yourself down. God alone will not let you down. So God is not loving if he does not tell us, praise me, worship me, honor me, live for me, love me. That's the most loving thing God can do because God alone is the source of our greatest satisfaction and joy and hope. It cannot be found anywhere else. Not in the things of this world, not in stuff, not in money, not in success, not in your accomplishments, not even in your family. In all those things you hold dear and get satisfaction from them. Nothing compares to the satisfaction, peace, hope, joy that is found in God. So what is the most loving thing God can do? To say, love me, worship me, obey me, honor me. So no surprise, what does God do with Job? God chooses, of course, his words carefully. And what does God do? He makes much of himself. And he changes Job's perspective. God reveals himself as so great and so mighty and so beyond our understanding that he can be trusted. The universe is full of mystery, including often suffering. And friends, our place is not to know the answers. Our place is to know God, in whom all the answers are found. God is enough. Prosperity is not enough. All the understanding in the world is not enough. Not achievement, not knowledge, not health. And so we love, we trust, and we worship God. The God who made Behemoth. Whatever that was, is. The God that made Leviathan. The God that created all things and governs over all things. No matter what we face or those we love face, we put our trust and our hope in God.